Welcome to Pause for the Truth, where you can sit back, relax, and hear an honest dialogue about health, wealth, legal, and social issues. The hosts are Dr. Rogers Kane, family practice physician, and Jocelyn Turner, health education consultant, with co hosts from the Northeast Florida Medical Society and its foundation. Stay tuned for the truth about matters affecting you and your family. We're here to tell you what's really going on and why. Good evening and welcome to Pause for the Truth. I'm Jocelyn Turner, co host, and tonight we're inviting you to slow down and look deeper at history than we often do. I know at least me. When people think about the civil rights movement, they often picture the 1950s and 60s, the marches, the speeches, the landmark laws. But those moments didn't come out of nowhere. They were built on decades of organizing, resistance, and courage that really make it into tech that and courage that really make it into textbooks. Tonight's conversation is titled Before the Marches: The Roots of the Civil Rights Movement, and we're honored to be joined by historian Jerry Urso of the James Weldon Johnson chapter of the, I'm not going to butcher it, Jerry. I'm going to let you tell people what ASALA is because I'm sorry, African Study, no, American Study, no, okay, I'm not.
Association of the Study of
Association of the Studies of African American
Life and History.
Life and History. Thank you. The discussion just isn't just about the past, it's about how history shapes our present social conditions, institutions, and lived experiences today. Let's pause for the truth and welcome in my co-host, Dr. Rogers Kane. How are you doing this evening, Dr. Kane?
I am doing great. Happy to be here another day on this earth with both feet on the ground, on top of the ground anyway.
Amen. Amen. Thanks for the sermonette. I appreciate that. And of course, joining us from behind the scene is our wonderful technology wizard, Tyrone Jackson. How are you doing this evening, Tyrone?
I'm doing wonderful, Miss Jocelyn. How are you doing?
It's a beautiful day. I mean, it wasn't freezing. I was just delighted for that because, living in Florida, it's just kind of hard to deal with these temperatures in the 20s that feels like the teens, but I won't complain because there's somewhere else where it was worse, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. Well, welcome to Jerry Urso. Listen, this guy has been showing up, popping up almost everywhere. If you're here in Northeast Florida, he is what I call a walking encyclopedia when it comes to history. I happened to attend an amazing tour of a museum that he helped. I'm saying this, he didn't say it, that he helped to curate. And he can tell you if you ever have a chance, I'll let him talk about it. Before we get started, welcome, Jerry. And you have so much to say about you. I'm not going to even try to start. So tell our audience a little bit or a lot about you, whatever you want to share. And
Okay,
welcome.
I'm the founder and the curator of the Solly Mitchell Civil Rights and Masonic History Museum. I am the historian for the James Weldon Johnson branch of ASALA, where Hazel Gillis serves as our president. I'm the historian for the Most Worshipful Union Grand Lodge of Florida, where my co-historian is Mike Kegler, and we serve under the auspices of the 20th Most Worshipful Grand Master, the Honorable Gus Harris. I'm a member of the Chi Rho fraternity. I've also the editor for Philaxis Magazine, chairman of the board of Philaxis Society, and I'm a fellow of the Philaxis Society.
And you wrote a book recently, didn't you?
Yes, ma'am. I wrote a book called Builders of Freedom, and it's Nassau County's Black public officials. That work was inspired by Dr. Cantor Brown's book, Florida's Black Public Officials, and what I did is zero in and expand on the stories of each person that he mentions in his listing and bullet points. And I try to bring those stories to life through either newspapers, biographical pieces, census records, or fraternal records.
Jerry, how did you get? I mean, I know all of us has an interest in something, but how did you get to be so interested in history, and you know so much about African American history. Talk about that. It's
My grand
amazing.
my grandfather was my hero when I was a kid. My grandfather, whenever we took a trip, it'd always either be to a museum or historic sites. And when he would come home, my grandfather would get on his typewriter and write a report of everything he saw. And he used to keep these registers of everything he saw. So, I mean, I was exposed to the Underground Railroad at probably 7 years old. I remember we went to some of the houses on the Underground Railroad. There was this one house, it was Dr. Seth Rogers' house. And he was an abolitionist. His family was from abolitionists. As a matter of fact, Dr. Rogers could have gotten any post by Abraham Lincoln. He was a Harvard graduate and a medical doctor. And Lincoln probably would have made him one of the heads of the of medicine for the United States Army, but he chose to serve in the experimental unit, the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, which is the first sanctioned African American military unit, and it later became the 33rd United States Colored Troops. And I've been to Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, and all those places. So as a child, I was just always fascinated by history.
So when we talk about, thank you, and we're fortunate to have you here in Northeast Florida to enlighten us. But our topic again tonight is before the marches, the roots of the civil rights movement. When we say before the marches, Jerry, what time period are we talking about, and why is it often overlooked?
Well, as far as organized civil rights movement, you have to start at the Revolutionary War. I think it's always important to say that Black history does not start with slavery, but the civil rights movement does. People were fighting for their rights even before the Revolutionary War. But as far as organizing, and you would have to take it to 1773. If you put up that first slide. So this is the Felix petition. And it was one of the first 5 that was submitted to Governor Thomas Hutchinson. And they were writing, calling for the abolition of slavery. And, you know, they would take these hard tones. And I think it's really important that there was, you see this document, and it's one of the first documents that people self-identified themselves instead of being labeled by what someone else called them. Okay. So when we look at the Revolutionary War, we think of the Boston Tea Party, and they referred to themselves as the Sons of Liberty. Well, in Boston, they considered this a conspiracy amongst the Negroes, and they self-identified. So there were 2 terms that they used. They called themselves the True Lovers of Liberty, and they called themselves the Sons of Africa. So they were already self-identifying at this point in history. So, and they were calling, you know, they were put this formal petition forward for the Massachusetts legislature, or to Governor Hutchinson.
So who were some of the early individuals or organizations laying the groundwork for civil rights long before national attention arrived?
The Prince Hall Masons, first and foremost, because they're the ones that are still around today. I mean, they are the you know, the most continuous African American organization, and civil rights was a part and parcel to their very being. So we go to the next slide. So while he's putting up that next slide, Abigail Adams is the first woman to hold a political position. She's the magistrate for the colonial court. Prince Hall's petition of 1774 was submitted, and she writes to her husband at this point, 1774. John Adams is raising money, and one of the quotes she says in the letter to her husband, it always appeared a most iniquitous scheme to me to fight for ourselves with a daily robbing and plundering from those who have just as good a right for freedom as we have. So Abigail Adams was a staunch abolitionist of her day. She actually inherited slaves and refused them in an estate from her family. So these letters were creating a buzz in Boston. And we'll go to the next one. So this is the 1777. Next slide. And there's a different tone. And the reason why is the 1777 petition changes its tone. And one of the words they use is, "We are patiently waiting," letting them know that they have submitted petitions before, but they use the Declaration of Independence as part of what they're fighting for by using the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, and all men created equal, and that sort. So they're using these fundamental arguments in their case to the colonial court. So it was in changing the tone. And the other thing to remember is these men were educated, even though their spelling and grammar might not have been perfect. These were very well read and learned men. We know that in those early meetings, they were speaking Mandingo in the lodge room. So with that, we know that anybody that speaks bilingual is a difficult thing to learn a second language and then to be fluent in it. So in that they were able to read and write and speak a second language from their first language, from their natural language. Now, did he learn Mandingo first or English second? That's up to debate. But the fact that he was able to be fluent in both, I think, shows to his intelligence and in the manner in which he writes these petitions to the colonial court. And they were signed by several men, including his son.
I was so surprised to see how much. I'm sorry, Dr. Ken, I just want to make this one comment. I was surprised until I went to the Prince Hall Museum, if I'm saying that right. I was so surprised to see how much of African American history that Masons were involved in. So many people that influenced the history of African Americans were Masons. And it was surprising to me to see that. I was like, wow. I mean, floors and floors and floors of individuals and the things that they did. It's just amazing. If you haven't gone, you need to. Go ahead, Dr. Kane.
Well, a couple of things. Where is the museum located at? Because we didn't state anything on that.
It's at 410 Broad Street, and we do group tours by appointment.
Okay, cool.
And it's a 6-story building, but 4 of the floors are completely dedicated to African American history.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That's great for a teacher to take their classroom if they're allowed to these days to go and do a tour on that, right?
And I want to be careful to say it wasn't just Prince Hall Masons. So secret societies were at the backbone of the early civil rights movement. And these gentlemen cross-pollinated cooperation and affiliation. So you had the Odd Fellows, the Knights of Pythias, the Knights of Tabor, Council of 12. You had mutual aid societies. So members belong to other organizations. And through that process, you have to remember that the telephone doesn't exist. Things were sent by sent by telegraph, wire telegraph by then, by clicking a keypad. So a lot of this information on organizing and building infrastructure came through cooperation of all these different societies that were taking place in the 1800s, moving into the turn of the century. So, all these organizations, had membership, they had dual membership. So, and when they would have their annual sessions, they would invite guest speakers from other organizations. So the information was out there. This is pre-Twitter. So they had to have some way in which they managed to organize. And the way they did it was these lodges and chapters and courts and so forth of all these different organizations and what they were. And so, I'll get to it later on in the slides, but when you find the Ku Klux Klan burning all these towns from Wilmington, Elaine Massacre, to Tulsa, to Perry, to Rosewood, to Ocoee, what's the first thing they burnt? The lodges and the churches, because they were the power structure, and the schools. So
Right.
in order to keep someone down, you got to take away the infrastructure first.
Yeah,
One of the thing I was going to ask, I heard you mention the Mandingo language. Most people, when they hear Mandingo, they think about Ken Norton and his role that he played. He played in
Right.
Roots, but not realizing that was a language by which many Africans were able to speak, I guess.
Depending on where they, and depending on where they came from on the continent, yes.
Yeah. Because I just wanted to clarify that, because when you hear Mandingo, the first thing you think about is Ken Norton and his role with Roots.
Well,
I didn't, Dr. Kane. Sorry, that's an age thing, because I didn't know that.
And another thing is, you find that anything that was positive in the Black community, they found a way to marginalize
Right.
it. Okay.
Right.
So using Mandingo as a negative term, right? Or that language, it was to dehumanize a race of people. So in some of the names, I'll give you one. Sambo was a common name, but it was actually a derivative from the African language. But so how do you dehumanize people? Take that name and turn it into a slur.
Right.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned, Jerry, was in terms of organizing, how important were institutions like Black churches, schools, newspapers, and fraternal organizations in sustaining the movement that was happening?
The church, the AME church, the Baptist church, Episcopal churches, they were at the front lines. I love it when some young people wear these T-shirts and say, "I'm not my ancestors," when in truth, they were fighters. I'm going to give you a quote. So Henry McNeil Turner, who was in the Georgia legislature, and he was AME bishop. So in his address to the Georgia legislature, he says, "I am here to demand my rights and to hurl thunderbolts at the men who had dared to cross the threshold of my manhood." They were not scared. The Jackson County wars in Florida, I mean, these were Black men standing up for their rights to hold land, to be educated. So, these militias called the Regulators, and eventually the Ku Klux Klan, they were standing up to these people on a regular basis. So to say that they didn't fight, I mean, in the Ocoee massacre of 1920, July Perry killed the first two men that entered his house after the Moses Norman ran to his house from the polling booth when he was chased by a mob. So, I mean, he was ultimately lynched, and I think they lifted his body up on a street pole, and they denigrated it for like 6 days before a Black mortician took it down and buried him in Orlando. But people weren't scared; they were fighting. And I think that's important for people to know, that it wasn't always "we shall overcome." People were demanding their rights, and they were not as scared to fight for their rights. And I think that's a part of history that needs also to get told. If you look at T. Thomas Fortune of the New York Age, he was definitely an antagonist in his writings and so forth. He was not afraid. And he used the power of the pen. So, when I talk about the early civil rights movement, you talk about the church, you talk about the HBCUs, you talk about the fraternal organizations, and you talk about the power of print. And so for an African-American to be so bold and to publish his opinions or to fight for the struggle of civil rights publicly in a newspaper made him a target. And they were not as scared to defend themselves publicly in the press.
When you talk about, history, and nowadays there's conversation about the importance of storytelling to make sure our history is told from one generation to the next. But what role did education and storytelling play in preserving resistance during this period?
It was paramount. A lot of, so for me, if Jocelyn, as you see all the articles I publish, I always make sure I cite my sources, whether it's the newspapers, church records, census records, and all that, because Black history is under attack. So in my opinion, we have to be above reproach when we put a history out there that people aren't used to hearing, and we should document it with facts so that it will stand up the test of anyone that tries to contest it.
Yeah, to let people know that it's, that they're facts. It's true. You're not making something up. If you're just tuning in, we are so pleased to have Jerry Urso. Jerry is a historian extraordinaire. I made that up for him because, again, as I said at the beginning, this guy's a walking encyclopedia. I recently visited the museum, went on a tour with him, and oh my goodness, the joke that Jerry and I have right now is I had to leave because he overwhelmed me with so much knowledge, but I actually just had to leave. But it's an amazing tour. And if you want to take some young people on a tour of history in Jacksonville, of African Americans, you need to schedule some time with Jerry. So Jerry, how do the decisions and policies from that early era still influence social and health outcomes today?
So there was political engagement in the northern states, but it was on a smaller scale because there was a Jim Crow version of the North with segregation and so forth. But there were members of the legislatures and courts that did exist prior to the Civil War. But after the Civil War, and one of the things I say is I do think that Abraham Lincoln had his prejudices, and he's said some things about if he could not end slavery and keep the Union, he would, and some of those quotes, but I like to put them in context. One of the things that I'll say about Lincoln is from his relationship with the second relationship with Frederick Douglass, because the two of them had a falling out. So when Lincoln comes to Washington, he's exposed to the Black intellectual class in Washington, D.C. So he is taking counsel from these very highly educated men in the District of Columbia. Secondly, the bravery of the United States colored troops and their leadership and their willing to fight for this country, I think had an effect on a lot of white officers. And I think that the fact that they won the war, I mean, having the ability to, toward the end of the last 3 years of the war, that you could bring in another 300,000 troops to your aid was the deciding factor in many ways. So there is no better way to overcome your prejudices than on the battlefield. And I think that it started in the Revolutionary War, because we know that Primus Trask Hall, there was, I believe, 20 white military soldiers or officers wrote letters on his behalf for his pension, talking about his bravery. And he fought in just about every single battle with George Washington. So he's present at Fort Liberty during the War of 1812. During the Civil War, there were so many stories. One in Florida is the Massachusetts 54th fought in the Battle of Olustee, and they lost that battle. And Black soldiers from the 3rd United States Colored Troops and pulled the train by rope. They had a train car, and they took all the wounded soldiers from the Battle of Olustee, grabbed some ropes, and pulled that train car from Olustee to Baker County.
Wow. And
then you have a lot of white officers that wrote letters home, like and well, exchanging letters with other officers and so forth. Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, Seth Rogers, and Colonel Tobridge, when they start writing their letters and talk about how brave and how decisive their actions were, bravery and cunning and so forth, I think these things have a take effect, because I always say people can be racist because they don't know, because it's convenient, because you haven't been exposed. So all you hear is about a group of people, so you take it as a gospel. But when you are finally exposed to that group of people and you see for yourself how intelligent and how brave, your opinions change as a matter of your environment. And that happens in a lot of cases. Now, everybody doesn't want to believe what they see, because they want to believe they're lionized and so forth. And some people can hold their prejudice, but you see a lot of letters toward the end of the war of people changing their opinions on the African Americans fighting in the war. So, a lot of these, they thought it was a bad experiment. I mean, there were rumors going around that people had tails. So if you live in, Lincoln, Nebraska or something, and you didn't have that kind of exposure, you're going to believe all these fairy tales and campfire stories. So when you get exposed to someone, it's hard to keep your prejudices when you see someone is intelligent or more intelligent than you and is just as brave or braver than you.
So if you're just tuning in, it's Black History Month, and we're starting up Black History Month off talking about before the marches, the roots of the civil rights movement. If you have any questions, please post them, because this guy can probably answer anything about any part of our history. But Jerry, you have some more slides you want to show them. Can we get to the next one and you share some of the information that you brought with you?
Mm-hmm. Next slide. Oh, that's the last slide. Keep going. Those should be the last two slides. If they're not, I'm sorry. Keep going. We should be going to Josiah T. Walls next. Okay. So Josiah T. Walls was a slave in Pennsylvania. He was captured by the Confederacy and forced to work for an artillery unit, mostly pulling cannons and so forth. That unit eventually is captured by the United States Colored Infantry, the 3rd out of Pennsylvania. He joins the 3rd, becomes an artillery specialist. So everything he learned by watching when he was a servant for the Confederacy, he takes that knowledge and brings it into this particular unit. When he comes to Florida, he's the general of the Florida militia, appointed by the governor. He serves 3 terms in the United States Congress. So he's the first African American to go to Washington from Florida. Interesting, all 3 of his elections were contested. So, like the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun. So contesting elections was the first wave of this new freedom African Americans got after the Civil War in the South. So you run for office, well, it was fraudulent. He didn't have enough votes. People voted that shouldn't have voted. So all 3 times that he ran, all 3 times, he never served the full 24 months. On average, he served about 18 months per term. He's one of the leaders of the Prince Hall Masons. He's one of the teachers in Rosewood. So in Rosewood, when that community first gets off the ground, he was the mayor of Gainesville of Alachua County. He was the deputy over Levy County and Alachua County. So he actually goes to those towns and teaches people how to read. Next
He was
slide.
a bad dude.
Yeah.
There's more coming.
Whoops.
Next slide.
It's coming.
So this is John Willis Maynard. He is actually the first African American ever elected to Congress. He was not allowed the seat. So basically there was a vote by Congress. I think he only got, I think it was like 120 to 50, if I remember, or close to that. So he was never allowed, even though the citizens of Louisiana voted. He won the majority of the vote. Congress refused to seat him. He moves to Jacksonville, Florida. He starts a newspaper. He's a poet. He's an editor. He's a journalist. He publishes landmark protests against disenfranchisement of the radical Republican Party. He's not afraid to take on the white liberals. John Willis Maynard, in reading between the lines, he knew which people were actually supportive and which people were somewhat for the cause. And he was not afraid to call out his own political party. He dedicated his whole entire life to the civil rights and Black equality through the legislature and through the power of the pen.
Now let me make sure I got that correct. You did say he moved to Jacksonville.
Yes.
And so then why have we not heard more about him while living in Jacksonville?
That's the point of the Solly Mitchell Museum. So, one of the things is people get a mindset. For the longest time, when people thought Black History Month, right? And I'm not talking people that are deep into Black history, but the average person, it's Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, and in Jacksonville, and this is no offense to James Weldon Johnson, the man did so much. I mean, I'm a member of his branch, but people start getting in the habit of naming everything after one person. So, we have Tupac's named after James Weldon Johnson, when there is probably at least 500 people that deserve a statue, a book, and a place of honor in Jacksonville history, or a separate monument. So, and that's one of the things. So we know that, Hiram Rebels and Robert Smalls are two of the most famous, and Josiah T. Walls in that first group of African Americans, but John Willis Maynard is actually the first ever elected.
Interesting.
Wow. So we're going to take a little break. Don't go anywhere, Jerry. Tyrone always surprises us with our mid-show moment. So we're going to let Tyrone do that mid-show moment, and we'll be right back. So continue to tune in to Pause for the Truth as we learn more from Jerry Urso. Take it away, Tyrone.
Welcome to Pause for the Truth Mid-Show Minute, February 3rd, 2026. Today, I'm taking a breath with you to talk about the digital shift in our movements, how we went from groundwork to the feed, then versus now. Then roots were planted in church basements, barbershops, front porches, face-to-face, hand-to-hand, name-to-name. Now it's timelines, comments, lives, DMs. Same hunger for justice, different soil. Let's start with the 24-hour news cycle. Back then, people fought for years to get a few minutes on national TV. Now, the cameras never sleep. That has a benefit. It's harder for injustice to hide. A local story can become a national moment before breakfast, but there's a cost. News fatigue, the cycle moves so fast that deep groundwork gets skipped. Roots need time. Headlines don't always give it. And social media, the new Black church, in some ways, yes, it's open to everyone, decentralized.
No gatekeepers deciding who leads.
If you've got a smartphone, you've got a microphone that mirrors the grassroots spirit, but there's a flip side. Algorithms can seal us inside echo chambers. We hear the voices we already agree with and miss the hard conversations that sharpen strategy. Speed versus strategy. Has it helped or hurt? Then preparation came first. Months of training. Then the march. Now a video goes viral. Protests ignite. Organizing tries to catch up. That speed helps. A single clip can deliver instant accountability. What used to be buried becomes undeniable. But the speed can also flatten the work into a moment. Likes, shares, a trending sound. While the movement, the patient movement, waits for follow through. Here's the truth I'm sitting with. The movement was never a series of spontaneous events. It was calculated,
brave,
deeply connected. People decided that the cost of silence was higher than the cost of resistance. So what do I do? What do you do? Mid-scroll, mid-shift, mid-show. I use the feed to spark. I use the groundwork to sustain. I show up online. I show up offline. I share the clip. I learn the context. I follow the moment. I fund the mission. I let the algorithm introduce me to a story. I let community introduce me to a plan. Then versus now doesn't have to be a fight. It can be a handshake. Speed meets strategy. Visibility meets accountability. The timeline plants the seed. The neighborhood grows the roots. This is your Pause for the Truth mid-show minute. Take a breath, choose depth, then move. I'll see you next time.
Wow, thank you, Tyrone. You always surprise us with the mid-show moment. If you're just tuning in, again, we are having our Black History Month kickoff by featuring historian Jerry Urso. We ended on John Willis Menard, and I don't know about any of you who are watching, but I never heard of this guy. And to hear that he was America's first Black representative elect, even though the privilege of serving was denied to him, and he ended up in Jacksonville. Jerry, let's talk about some other folks that you brought. Is there another slide next? Are you finished talking about
15 more?
Go ahead.
Okay, next slide. Emanuel Fortune is the father of T. Thomas Fortune. He's the first African-American elected to the legislature in Florida in 1868, although he was followed by others. There was several part of the 1868 Constitutional Convention. He served the Florida House of Representatives, and he advised the governor during Reconstruction. We had 3 Republican governors. We had Harrison Reed. We had Hossein Hart. If you ever seen the movie To Kill a Mockingbird, and I'm not saying she got inspired by this story, but you have to look at the story of Hossein Hart and think this was the inspiration for To Kill a Mockingbird in some way, right? So his father is the founder of Jacksonville, the Isaiah Hart Bridge. He's a slave owner, has one of the largest slave inventories on his slave censuses. He's also part of the slave trade. His son is an attorney. He's one of the few members of the House of Representatives that did not sign to secede from the Union at the beginning of the Civil War. In 1859, he is in Tampa, Florida. We just know the man's name by Adam. So he takes the case to an appellate court, and the murder conviction is overturned. A mob storms the courthouse, removes Adam from the courthouse, and lynches him in front of Hossein Hart. So this changes him forever. He's part of that delegation in 1866 that is actually registering people to vote to become members of the Constitutional Convention, to get elected. He's part of, and during his administration in 1870, he has an African American as his Secretary of State. He has several African Americans in different cabinet positions or advisory positions. Emanuel Fortune is one of them. He was a prominent journalist himself. He was a fighter for civil rights, and he was one of them people that don't back down. When Frederick Douglass comes to Jacksonville, he's one of the people on the dais for that big monumental occasion when Frederick Douglass came down for the tropical exposition that was held in Jacksonville. He was another one that would call out his own political party. And you have to remember, so there were a lot of accommodationists in the Republican Party. So in the early years after the Civil War, you had your radical Republicans. So by the 1885 Constitutional Convention, they're becoming more accommodationist. So, they're negotiating on bad faith in many ways. So by 1885, there's only a handful of African-American senators and legislatures. And by the turn of the century, there's zero. So a lot of African-Americans had to rely on white Republicans to represent their interests. So one was Horatio Bisbee. There's several buildings named after Bisbee in Florida. But he has a relationship with Judge Joseph E. Lee, who is the first African-American elected judge in the South. And they have a bromance, like men would not write the way they did, but in the times, in the 1800s, even Abraham Lincoln, they had what they call bromances. They would write very affectionately to each other. So when you see the correspondences between Judge Lee, who was one of the heads of the Republican Party, and Horatio Bisbee, they were very affectionate, in their correspondences to each other.
Now, so I want to ask a question. In what ways do you see echoes of these early struggles in modern movements for justice and equity?
So, in today's time, I don't like really talking politics a whole lot, but we have, in these days, there weren't political lobbies, right? Today, our government is bought and paid for. I don't care how you slice it and dice it. I mean, the lobbies and the white people's interests are represented no matter who's in office, Republican or Democrat. Their representation is represented. So you see this push for denying Black history, being removed from schools. I mean, how can Uncle Tom's Cabin be offensive? How can the Jackie Robinson story be offensive? Or one of the other books, what was it? One of the other books that was banned. I can't think. It played for the Pittsburgh Pirates. Give me a second. It escapes me for a second. Roberto Clemente. I mean, you're talking about some of these books being banned because he talked about some of the racism that he felt. But why are people afraid of the truth? And so it bothers me sometimes when people have certain beliefs, but because of a political expediency and the chance of being reelected to obtain a certain financial wealth, you are going to go against your conscience because it fills your pocket instead.
All right, now, Jerry, can you do one other thing to kind of assist us? Because you've given us a couple of names thus far, and we're on Emmanuel right now. And I hear you continue to mention the Republican Party. And I think we have some people out there who may be thinking a Republican Party. So let's also bring into view, when was the shift from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party shifted in ideology and direction?
Woodrow Wilson.
So we're talking 1930.
So you got Woodrow Wilson, who's probably the most racist president in our history, the first movie played. Then you have, he's followed by Warren G. Harding, right? So this is the end of the Republican Democrat shift. So, Harding, one of the stories about Harding is he's running on a civil rights platform. He's speaking in Birmingham, Alabama, and while he's running for office, and he actually gets run out of Birmingham after the Red Summer of 1919. The press picked a lot of this massacres, which I always find interesting. So in Black newspapers, they'll call it a massacre. In white newspapers, they would refer to them as race riots. So, you have the Tulsa, then you have the Ocoee massacre. So James Weldon Johnson, Captain Floyd of Jacksonville branch of the NAACP, Bishop John Hurst, they go to St. Augustine, Florida, where the president-elect is vacationing before he's sworn in January. And so they have a meeting with him discussing the racial climate in America, and specifically the Dyer Bill, which was anti-lynching legislation. So this anti-lynching legislation actually took 100 years to go through. I mean, it definitely had a new name. It was the Emmett Till bill, but there were people circling the whole country to get support of this anti-lynching legislation. So during the so then you have Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover. So then it's when the Roosevelt administration comes in, you start to see a slight shift, and then it's really you see the biggest shift in when the Nixon Kennedy. There's a famous phone call that gets placed where Martin Luther King's in jail and Nixon's upset that Kennedy gets the call first to have Martin Luther King, using his influence to get him released. So you see this gradual shift, and then it comes with the Southern Plan, where you got the Dixiecrats and so forth. So like, I don't really like getting into a whole lot of politics. I like sticking to straight history, but you see, it wasn't an overnight platform shift, but you see this gradual shift taking place. And I think one of the seminal moments was the Kennedy Nixon election is one of the, and then when Kennedy comes in office, and then it's Lyndon Baines Johnson that gets Congress to support bills that he wouldn't support earlier when he was a senator, the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and then his war on poverty.
Jerry, how did regional differences, especially in the South versus the North, shape early civil rights strategies?
Okay, we'll go a couple slides and I'll get to that.
Okay.
So, like I said, there was still segregation and still racism in the North, but in the South, they were facing more threats to the Ku Klux Klan and so forth. So, here's Robert Meacham. Robert Meacham is actually the co-author of the Florida Constitution. He's on the committee. So like when you think of the Declaration of Independence, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, he's on the committee that shapes the Florida Constitution, and it discusses civil rights for all and equality and tranquility. He serves as a senator. He's also helps form the Florida State Militia. So these militias were protecting Black voters during Reconstruction. And it isn't until the Great Compromise of 1877 when the federal troops are pulled out, and then you see a decline in African Americans in the Florida militia, and they turned into mostly entirely white. He actually is one of the reasons why there's a public school system in Florida. Him and Thomas Warren Long, who we'll get to next. So there was always the roadmap that the NAACP and the Urban League use now of, health, welfare, political engagement, education, when they formed the HBCUs and the local high schools. So there was always the interest that, the Urban League and the NAACP support today. That blueprint was established during Reconstruction.
Next slide. Thank you.
So this is John Henry Ballou. He's from Providence, Rhode Island, graduates from Brown University. He's the first African-American admitted to the Rhode Island bar. He successfully defeats the cohabitation laws in Rhode Island. So it isn't until 1956, I believe, Loving v. Virginia. They made the movie about the Loving family, that the interracial marriage. So he actually defeats that in the Supreme Court in Rhode Island almost 100 years earlier. He's an educator. He's one of the professors at Cookman Institute, downtown Jacksonville. He's a key witness to the case of Bonaparte v. State. He's very much maligned. So he leaves Jacksonville for a little while. He starts a newspaper in Jacksonville in La Villa. He moves to Alabama, and then while in Alabama, he becomes a successful attorney there. And there was a riot at a speaking engagement, and they tried to blame him through the press, but we know they wasn't successful because he would have been disbarred but he had to defend himself of starting a riot. But these are the kind of things that they did to black lawyers in that day, anything to disbar them. But he was definitely a very powerful newspaper man and early civil rights attorney.
So, how did early civil rights leaders balance survival with resistance in extremely hostile environments?
I don't know if they ate or slept. I mean, when you think about all of them, you know, the power that most of them were all involved in newspapers. They were educators. They were fighting cases, and they were experts. I mean, they defeated some of the most influential civil rights cases. Some of them took case right here in Jacksonville or in the state of Florida. We'll get to them in a few more slides, but the blueprint for the Niagara movement, and you know, there's a book called The Army of Lions, and it's the early civil rights attorneys. And I suggest everybody read this book. It's called The Army of Lions, and it details all these attorneys from all around the country fighting segregation. Thurgood Marshall stands on the shoulders of a lot of the African-American attorneys at the turn of the 18th to 19th century. 1800s to the 1900s. The landmark cases and the precedent that those cases set were cases that could be used later to the state Supreme Courts and the federal Supreme Court.
And that was the book of, that was, what did you say, the book of?
It's called the Army. It's called the Army of Lions.
Army of Lions.
Yes, and it's a really, really good book. The name of the author escapes me off the top of my head, but if you Google civil rights and the Army of Lions, the book will come up, and it details a lot of these cases and a lot of these attorneys that no one ever heard of.
I can't believe something slipped your mind, Jerry. Really, you know. Next slide, please, so that we can.
I get nervous when I talk in public, so bear with me.
You're doing great. You have so much to say. I want to get through as many as we can. We're gonna have to invite you back, by the way.
So this is my, as you know, when you tour my museum, this is my favorite story to tell. So this is Thomas Warren Long. He is a slave on a sugarcane plantation on Beaver Street called the Roberts Plantation. So he was also a minister. He was one of the ministers. So I'm sure that, you know, a lot of the plantations in that area would go to a centralized location for church on Sunday. And a lot of the communication took place in the church, even in front of white overseers. So depending on, you know, they might have used different references or different scriptures and so forth in the Bible. It comes to find out that the Lincoln's Army, as he referred to it, is in Yulee, Florida. Him and his brother kiss his wife and kids goodbye, and they make it on foot from Jacksonville to Yulee. And this is before Highway 17, before Main Street, and before Route 95. So in the cover of darkness to make the 25-mile trek is amazing. And so he joins Lincoln's Army. By the time he musters out, he's a master sergeant of Company G. We know that he'd gone on several suicide missions, as documented by the letters of Dr. Seth Rogers and also by Thomas Wentworth Higginson's book, Army Life, is his memoirs of Army life during the Civil War. He also, get this, by 1868, he has his doctorate in hermeneutics. He's a member of the Constitutional Convention. He's the organizer of several churches from Duval, Marion, Alachua, Hernando, Hillsborough, and Key West, Florida, Monroe County. He starts Masonic lodges in all these locations. St. Pete, Florida, St. Paul AME Church still stands as one of the last churches that he built that still stands, Mount Olive in Palaca. He does missionary work. He's a superintendent of public schools for Madison County. And he's described by his contemporaries as a warrior for manhood of rights of all. If you go to the next slide, I'd like to read his famous quote.
Wow, I'm tired just listening to all that he did. Gee.
So when he musters out, Thomas Wentworth Higginson interviews him and asks him how it felt to fight for his country. And this is one of my favorite quotes. He says, "If we hadn't become soldiers, all might have gone back as it was before. Our freedom might slip through the two houses of Congress, and President Lincoln's 4 years have gone by and done nothing for us. But now things can never go back because we have showed our energy, our courage, and our natural manhood. Another thing, suppose you had kept your freedom without enlisting in this army. Your children might have grown up and been free and been well cultivated, but it would always be flung in their faces that your father did not fight for his country, fight for his freedom. And what could he have answered? Never can you say this about the African race no more. Thomas Warren Long, 1865.
Wow. Wow, that says a lot. And, nowadays when people choose not to vote, I often think about stuff like this, Jerry, how people just, I don't get it. But anyway, go ahead. Next slide. Because you have such good stuff to show. I want to make sure we get through as many.
So here we have James Weldon Johnson. And for the life of me, I want people to know that he was so much more than just a poet that wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing. He was an attorney. He actually is one of the first post-Reconstruction attorneys to pass the bar. There's some debate whether he was the first, but he had an oral examination. One of the examiners refused to interview him, and he passed the oral examination that lasted for 3 hours before he got his law degree. He was a civil rights activist. He becomes a field secretary for the NAACP, which I think, when they ever seen that TV show, Dangerous Jobs, they used to have a TV show on TV. Don't talk about how all these different dangerous jobs. I don't think there could have been a job in human history more dangerous than being a field secretary for the NAACP in 1819, where he's going to all these towns in the rural South to interview people to document lynchings.
Can you read what he said, that quote you have on there, Jerry? Or I'll read it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I believe in young men because I believe in the principles that young men today stand for. I believe that the present generation of young men are going to be better and do better than any generation of young men who has preceded them. That's awesome to me. I've never heard that before.
So it's funny you say that. So his father is a very prominent minister in Jacksonville. We know he was the head waiter at the St. James Hotel. In his book, Along the Way, he details two things. His relationship with Dr. Alexander Darnes, who him and his brother used to sweep the floor of his doctor's office, which is actually the location of the former main branch of the Jacksonville Public Library over on Catherine Street. So he's exposed to African-American men that are holding high positions, right? Dr. Darnes is one of the most respected physicians during the 1893 yellow fever epidemic. He cures so many people that when at his funeral at historic Mount Zion AME Church, the audience is split between black and white, and they had an overflow outside the church. They actually had to have someone stand on the steps and repeat the sermon to the people standing outside. And then secondly, his father takes him to Joseph E. Lee's courtroom to see what a black man in a position of power looked like. So I really think that quote is actually based upon his life experiences and the shoulders that he stood on. And I think he understood the moment that the next generation after him was going to do even better things.
Wow. Next slide. Thank you, Jerry.
So this is J. Douglas Wetmore. He is James Weldon Johnson's law partner. He's one of the first NAACP attorneys. In my opinion, he's Ben Crump before Ben Crump. When you see he's involved with the NAACP, he's involved with the Negro Business League, he's involved with the Colored Lawyers Association. He is part of the Niagara movement. So they had a trolley car boycott in Jacksonville. So 50 years before Rosa Parks, Reverend Andrew Patterson refuses to give up his seat on a segregated trolley car. Now, African Americans took a lot of exception to this because it was a black railroad company that built that railroad after the Great Fire. I mean, trolley car system after the Great Fire of 1901, and it was a black-owned transportation company. So they took exception to not being able to be seated. So when Andrew Patterson refuses to give up his seat in ultimately elected, it's J. Douglas Wetmore and Attorney Purcell's in the famous case Patterson v. Florida. And he actually is the first attorney in the South to defeat segregation laws. Like I said, this is 50 years before Rosa Parks.
Was he a black guy?
No, he was. So if you ever heard about Jane Weldon Johnson's book, Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man, it's actually about him, but it really addresses a lot of, in retrospect, it really addresses colorism in the black community as well. Because you see a lot of these, the most staunchest, most militant newspapermen and attorneys, a lot of them passed. Now, the other thing was that J. Douglas Wetmore passed because there were certain states where black attorneys couldn't go into these courtrooms. So he's actually able to go into a lot of these courtrooms. So, and then that causes, rifts between people, being able to pass, not pass. And, it's funny because his grandson denies that his grandmother was white. Because that's his grandson saying that his grandmother was actually a Cajun from Louisiana, but she passed for white. So a lot of then the black presses in the North were very supportive of him. Some of the black press was very against him because he became actually very wealthy and successful in real estate. But he takes on President Roosevelt at a time when Booker T. Washington needs Roosevelt's support. So there were the members of the 25th in Brownsville, Texas. They were under attack by whites, and they finally defend themselves. And they actually, I believe it's 167 African Americans were dishonorably discharged without a trial. He takes it to court. This is kind of the beginning of a little bit of the rift between Du Bois and Washington. But I want to clarify one thing. Did they always agree? No. Did they take a few shots at each other? Yes. But the rift between those two, I think, is really overblown. No civil rights people agreed on everything 100%. So you had, at this time, you had the loyalists to Du Bois, you had the loyalists to Washington, you have, the Marcus Garvey and the NIA, you have A. Philip Randolph, with the unionization. And so one thing that nobody has ever asked the white community, who's the leader of the white community? So to put these questions on African Americans all the time, well, who's your leader? It doesn't make sense to me, right? But they had, he had four men that had different opinions. They were all going to the same place. They just had different methodology of how they were going to get there. And Washington is not that much different than Du Bois. In my opinion, Washington is just a generation behind. Washington, with the whole vocational, paying attention to vocational and jobs, they and especially in the South, his environment is a whole lot different than Du Bois's in New York and and in Braintree, Massachusetts. Not Braintree. I forgot what town it is off the top of my head, but up in in Massachusetts. So their delivery and how they outlook a thing are based on different experiences, right? And I don't think Washington was against people going to college. I think he wanted to get the African community grounded into the middle class, join the middle class, do the vocational trades, save your money, and send your kids to college. So I don't think that I always think that it was so overblown to pit Du Bois and Washington against each other.
Jerry, why is it important, especially for professionals and community leaders, to understand this deeper history?
Because things don't happen in a vacuum. Everybody stands on somebody else's shoulders. So where we are today is a combination of where people came from along the way and that their struggles, and that we keep on building upon those institutions that they built. People love to take shots at people from the 1800s and say they didn't fight, but all four of those HBCUs in Florida and HBCUs across the country, they built them. They were the ones that sacrificed pennies and dimes at a time to build these institutions. You know, yes, they got money from those land grant schools and so forth, but the AME Church, you know, that they were organized in like the 11th district in Florida. I mean, these people sacrificed everything, and they cross-pollinated. Even if you weren't a Methodist, people supporting Edward Waters College. If you look at the board of directors and a lot of the professors at Daytona Institute before it merged with Cookman, you see that there were Methodist and Baptist teaching and supporting and the Florida Baptist Academy, the same thing, you know, with Bishop Waldron and Matthew Gilbert and so forth. You know, people cross-pollinated. It was a larger issue than denomination to build these institutions. It was people really saw the bigger picture, and they cooperated so much. I really need to hit that home, because when you think about the financial structure, the 5 richest men in Jacksonville were, or Northeast Florida, were insurance men. So you had A.L. Lewis with Afro Mutual Life Insurance Company. You had Captain Floyd, who ran People's Life Insurance Company. You had Winfred Parker with Citizens Life Insurance Company. You had the Surtons with the Union Mutual. Then you had Dr. Norton with Central Life Insurance Company. But if you ever notice, the board of directors of these colleges and the board of directors for the Lincoln Golf Club and the board of directors in for America Beach, they were competitors by day, but they pooled their money for the greater good. They cooperated financially to support each other. They to build Brewster's Hospital, to build Travelers Aid, to build all these infrastructures. They all pooled their money together. So they weren't. Did they compete as businessmen? Yes, but they saw the greater good, and they all worked together. So moving right along, I got to make sure I mention some women. This is Blanche May Armwood. A lot of people consider her the female Booker T. Washington. She's the first African-American in Florida to get a law degree. She ends up becoming a political powerhouse. How she is not mentioned in the same breath as Ida B. Wells is just beyond my comprehension. She starts the Urban League in Tampa. So gas technology was a big thing. So if those of you remember the 70s and 80s when microwaves were starting to become a big thing in every household. Do you remember all those cookbooks people had for microwave cooking? So she's writing books for gas stove cooking, and she's going around the country teaching women how the gas company is actually paying her. She's a national activist. So, you know, during those 1920s, she's traveling the country with a Winchester rifle in her car to support anti-lynching legislation. She ends up having a close relationship with President Harding and President Coolidge. She actually campaigns for both of them. She's friends with Mary, so she's helping to establish Bethune-Cookman. She helps establish Clara Fry Hospital in Tampa. She goes to Denver. She starts to do she's one of the first members of the NAACP in Louisiana. She's all over the country. She's building vocational schools for women all across the country. And, you know, she died campaigning for the Republican Party. Calvin Coolidge, who was no longer president, asked her to come to Boston to help campaign for the Republican ticket. And she caught pneumonia and comes back to Florida and passed away. This is Mary E.C. Day Smith. Trying to go fast, but I know we got time to. So she's one of the first women to be a licensed minister by the AME Church. She began her mission work for the AME Church in Tallahassee, and she was ordained in 1894. She's one of the pioneers of the Women Club movement. So she's involved in about 3 or 4 of the women clubs. She's really heavily involved with Clara White, and so you know she's establishing. I got to plug up. I apologize. Okay. And so you know she's instrumental in the women's club movement. That women club movement is what gets women the right to vote. You know, people don't realize that Susan B. Anthony excluded the African American women. So it's really important to understand that the Black Women's Club movement was so important to getting their right to vote. And so why was the 1920 presidential election so important? Well, African American women are now part of the electorate. So it changes the political landscape, and that terrifies the Ku Klux Klan, because now you have, because in many places, African American women outnumbered their white counterparts almost 4-1 in some districts. So it was a threat. So yeah, like I said, Blanche Armwood needs to be mentioned in the same breath as Ida B. Wells. I mean, she's just up there. Winona Cargill Alexander, she's a pioneering in social work. She's one of the founders of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. She's the first African American to graduate the New York School of Philanthropy and Columbia University. She becomes New York's first professional social worker. When she comes to Jacksonville, she starts the Jacksonville Negro Welfare League, which is the precursor to the Urban League. She's administrator for the Travelers Aid, which is really important. Why was Travelers Aid important? So Travelers Aid helped travelers that were traveling around the country, especially during the Great Migration. So at this time, they're using the 13th and 14th Amendment against African Americans because slavery is still legal if it's for the penal system. So you get someone traveling and they don't have any money on them. What do? You arrest them for vagrancy. They do 2 years building on the chain gang. So Travelers Aid was really important, finding people to, when they get there, to have a couple dollars in their pocket, or a couple quarters, I guess, at the time. Food, shelter, places to worship, all that, they provided all these different services. This is Eartha White. Eartha starts. So here's a real quick story about Eartha White, since she's more well-known than everybody else. So during that election in 1920, the Ku Klux Klan parades through Jacksonville to imitate, to scare African Americans from voting. This lady is barely 5 feet tall. I think she's 4'10", 4'11". She actually grabs a notebook and is writing the names down of the people that were disenfranchised. At the same time, there's a member from the Associated Press here covering. The police chief actually arrests him and smashes his camera, so there's no evidence, and he's locked up for like 3 or 4 days, so he can't report on the intimidation that is going on in Jacksonville. But she starts, the colored old folks home. She's a healthcare provider. She's at the ground floor of Brewster's Hospital. She starts youth programs. They start a child welfare advocate. One of the other things is, there's, like the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun. There was an opioid epidemic in Florida at the time. It was, it was called laudanum. So they were treating alcoholism and drug addiction at the turn of the century.
Wow. Is that it, Jerry? Because I want to keep you, we promised to keep you for an hour, but you have to know you're going to come back. But I want to ask you one more question before we wrap up. What is one truth about early civil rights history you wish more people understood?
How hard they fought not only how hard they fought, the risk that they were taking. You see the dogs and the fire hoses in the 1950s and 60s. They were being lynched in the 1900s. They were burning down entire communities, and people weren't taking this. I don't know where people get that their ancestors weren't fighters. These people were fighting tooth and nail for everything they had and everything they built. So it is so disrespectful sometimes to say those things about these early pioneers and the risk they took. I mean, they imagine going to Washington and testifying on the Ku Klux Klan hearings, and what a risk you were taking to be publicly in the newspapers listing your testimony and listing what your name was and where you were from, that you testifying against the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jerry. This is amazing. And I'm proud that we were able to have you on as Black History Month is kicked off. Again, I think you're a wealth of knowledge, and just as always, every time I hear you, I learn so much. Dr. Kane, or I'll start with Tyrone. Tyrone, do you have any final thoughts regarding tonight's podcast? Tyrone, you're muted.
First of all, I want to thank Jerry for coming on the show. I think you said it, Ms. Jocelyn, a wealth of information, a overflow of information. I admonish anyone who's listened to play this over and go back and compare some of the dates and the times so you can have a chronological understanding of the information that he's giving. Once again, thank you, Jerry. And I just think this is a great information.
Thank you. Dr. Kane, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I want to also thank Jerry for coming on. The walking encyclopedia, for as I'm concerned, with what he knows. What I would like to see is more of the, since the school system is not letting us learn more about the African-American history, I'd love for some of these churches to start taking a tour, making appointments, and taking a tour with Jerry to educate some of the youth in these, within that, within the whatever church it might be, within that community, to learn more about the history, because that's one thing that we're not seeing much of these days. And this is, I'm just odd. I know nothing compared to what Jerry knows as it relates to AA history.
Thank you. And thank you, Jerry, for grounding us in history and reminding us that progress is never accidental. It's built by people who often labored in silence, under threat, and without recognition. Tonight's conversation reminds us that understanding where we are requires honesty about where we've been. The roots of the civil rights movement are deep, complex, and still shaping our communities today in education, health, justice, and opportunity. To our listeners, thank you for pausing with us. If this conversation resonated with you, we encourage you to share it and continue learning beyond what we're traditionally taught. This has been Pause for the Truth. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep seeking the truth. Good evening.
We appreciate you spending time with us on Pause for the Truth. Ms. Jocelyn Turner and Dr. Rogers Kane are grateful for your support. Don't forget to like us on Facebook, catch us live on Twitch, and most importantly, subscribe on YouTube. A big shout out to Tyrone Jackson at Call Tyrone IT Services for keeping us connected. Join us every Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for more enlightening discussions. Thanks, and see you next week.